You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon, author of That Beast Was Not Me, One Forensic Psychologist and 5 Decades of Conversations with Killers. Dr. Smalldon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Start by telling us a little bit about yourself and this fascinating career that you've built.
I'm retired now after about a quarter century in private practice as a forensic psychologist. During that 25 years, my practice was based in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, but I consulted on about 300 death penalty cases originating in more than 55 counties throughout Ohio, and worked on some death penalty cases in other states and in federal court as well. I also was frequently the court-appointed expert, actually probably close to 1,500 times, in matters pertaining to child custody. So my entire practice wasn't criminal. Also consulted on civil cases, a lot of competency to stand trial, and criminal responsibility, aka sanity cases. And one of the things that I tried to emphasize in my book, and that I thought was one of the most interesting aspects of my journey, was the strange path that I took to become a forensic psychologist. As a young man, that thought had never crossed my mind.
One thing I struggle with, Jeff, is the term forensic psychologist. For the civilians here, which is tens of thousands of us here on Mind Over Murder, what the heck is a forensic psychologist?
I'm glad you asked that, actually, Bill, because that question comes up frequently when I meet people and tell them that I had a career as a forensic psychologist. Immediately, that word opens up the file in their brain that contains pathology pictures and crime scene analysis, and that's not what I did at all. Most of my, and I'm going to talk about the criminal part of my practice, most of what I did was evaluate suspects after they had been arrested. I wasn't a profiler. I wasn't the person trying to identify the as yet unidentified suspect in a violent crime. Typically, defense attorneys, since they were the ones who had a client needing to be evaluated, were the ones who would contact me following the defendant's arrest. In a death penalty case, they would ask me to evaluate their client with an eye toward whether there were any issues that they should be thinking about in terms of a mental health defense at trial. Is there anything that points toward a not guilty by reason of insanity defense, for example? Are there any issues relevant to the competency to stand trial question? And I'm still speaking specifically about death penalty cases. Assume that there's a strong likelihood our client will be found guilty of these crimes he's been charged with. If he is, that'll mean we'll go to a sentencing hearing, and what information about his background and so on can you find that might be found relevant by members of a jury when they need to make the decision about whether this person should die or be allowed to live the rest of his life in prison.
When you're expressing opinions like that in a death penalty case, Jeff, are you one of the experts who's sworn in, and do you have to testify about what your findings would be, or are you off behind the scenes expert?
No, I would be a testifying expert. If the case went to trial, and a lot of death penalty cases never do, they get pled out before trial, but if they go to trial, I think I can only remember 2 death penalty cases where I appeared as an expert witness during the guilt-innocence phase of the trial, the first phase. Typically, my role would be in the second phase, typically referred to as the sentencing or mitigation phase. And at that point, I would be a live witness appearing before the jury to share my findings.
As you mentioned, you took a very interesting route to get where you are. A lot of that information is told in your book, That Beast Was Not Me. And that title, which is great, I really love it. It's a quote from Charles Manson. Why don't we start this conversation down the serial killer path by having you tell us about your relationship with Charles Manson?
My relationship, so to speak. I was in my early 20s, a senior in high school, the generally rule-following son of an FBI agent, and I developed a fascination with the Manson case, which had meant nothing to me at all in August of 1969 when it occurred. I was a sophomore in high school. I didn't pay attention to the case at all. But when I was in England in 1973, hitchhiking around before my fall semester, my junior year abroad in Cambridge, I read a book about that case that I just thought was incredibly interesting. It was Ed Sanders' book, The Family. And then in 1974, which my senior year in college was 74, 75, I read Helter Skelter, the best-selling true crime book of all time about the Manson case by one of the prosecutors in the case. And as I say in my book, and I think this suggests something a little bit pathological about myself, I read that book in a single sitting from about 3. I started at 3 in the afternoon, kept drinking coffee all night, finished it late morning the next day. And I was just so fascinated by it. And one of the things that fascinated me the most was that a lot of these young people who had followed Manson and acted at his behest sounded like they came from backgrounds not that much different from my own, middle class. And I couldn't figure it out that they would be willing to kill for this career criminal with a 4th or 5th grade education. And one day in class, my professor, I was taking a class in abnormal psychology, and my professor mentioned that he had read Helter Skelter. So I thought, I need to talk with him about this book that I'm so fascinated by. So I stayed after class that day, and I raised this issue with him about these young people who had followed him, who came often from middle-class backgrounds. And I said, I wonder if it's a little more complicated than you would get the sense it is from the media portrayals of these people. And he said, have you ever thought of writing them? And I said, no, never, not once. The thought of writing members of the Manson family had never crossed my mind. And he said, it might be interesting to hear what they sound like on paper. So I eventually did that. And that was the start of my correspondence with Manson, Lynette Squeaky Fromme, who later earned her own brand of infamy in September of 1975 by attempting to assassinate then President Ford, and a number of other members of the Manson family. But getting back to your question, Kristin, I was apparently the only person who hadn't received the memo caption, "Don't try to bullshit Charles Manson." And so I did try to bullshit Charles Manson.
In what way?
I remember sitting down to write him my first letter. I knew where he was in Folsom Prison. And basically, I just wanted to write a letter that he would respond to. So, I was 21 years old. I was willing to be manipulative. And I told him that my main interest was in his music and his lyrics, because I knew he was a frustrated musician. Mm-hmm. And he wrote back and said, this is so much shit. Don't bother me with this stuff. Music and poetry for what? It doesn't mean anything. Basically, if you're prepared to be real with me, write me back. If so, or if not, stop bothering me. And so I was a little taken aback because I didn't really want to make Charles Manson angry with me. This was 1975, 6 years after the murders. And so I wrote him back a more honest letter. And I told him I was a senior in college. I'd read Helter Skelter, another book about his case, and so on. I was interested in it. And I think the hook, maybe, I told him that I was at least open to the possibility that the authors of these books about the case hadn't gotten everything right. So he wrote me back what I later learned for Manson was quite a thoughtful contemplative letter. And right at the beginning of this letter, he said, take all you've ever heard about the family and think about it as backwards. Our side of the family was never told. That beast was not me, but it's what everyone needs me to be, so they make me up to be a reflection of society's fears and lies.
When you want to bet on sports, played on a field or ice or courts, Bet Rivers is the place. Over, under, money line, same game parlays, it's all fine.
We'll put a smile on your face.
Bet Rivers Sportsbook is your home for chance, where you can experience the thrill of betting on the sports you love. Bet Rivers Sportsbook. Download the app.
Take a chance.
Must be 21 plus and physically present in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. Void where prohibited. Terms and conditions apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
This podcast is sponsored by IQ Bar.
I've got good news and bad news. Here's the bad news. Most protein bars are packed with sugar and unpronounceable ingredients. The good news? There's a better option. I'm Will, and I created IQ Bar plant protein bars to empower doers like you with clean, delicious, low-sugar brain and body fuel. IQ Bars are packed with 12 grams of protein, brain nutrients like magnesium and lion's mane, and zero weird stuff. And right now, you can get 20% off all IQ Bar products, plus free shipping. Try our delicious IQ Bar sampler pack with 7 plant protein bars, 4 hydration mixes, and 4 enhanced coffee sticks. Clean ingredients, amazing taste, and you'll love how you feel. Refuel smarter, hydrate harder, caffeinate larger with IQ Bar.
Go to eatiqbar.com and enter code BAR20 to get 20% off all IQ Bar products plus free shipping. Again, go to eatiqbar.com and enter code BAR20.
And then the letter went on and ended in the poetic, go and start a garden wherever you walk, Jeff. You are the new world. If you do these things, there'll be no need to communicate with me anymore at all. And anyway, so that letter I always regard as the first proper letter I received from Manson, and really the start of a correspondence that then spanned a period of about 2 years.
How many letters back and forth do you think?
Hard to say exactly. There were quite a few postcards, quite a few letters. I would say Manson probably wrote me 15 or 20 times.
Wow.
So he wasn't interested in cutting off the communication when he said, go forth and do these worthwhile things. He was willing to have a conversation with you on an ongoing basis, it would appear.
He seemed willing, though I certainly don't want to leave the impression that Manson seemed eager to have Jeff Smalldon as a correspondent. He never gave that impression, but he at least seemed open to hearing from me until he didn't. At one point during the correspondence, when I did something that, for reasons I didn't understand at the time at all, made him extremely angry. And at that point, I thought the correspondence was over. But then he reached out to continue it.
How would you characterize Charles Manson? It does sound like your correspondence with him, from what I read of it, was all over the place. Some days you said he was very contemplative, but I can't imagine that being his normal everyday state. So if you had to, the English teacher is going to ask you to throw some adjectives out there, how would you characterize Charles Manson?
Gee, Kristin, you're not willing to accept that contemplative is Charles Manson's default setting?
Well, he had plenty of time to think deep thoughts, that's for sure.
Well, you're absolutely correct about that, I might say. No, he was all over the map. Occasionally, I would catch him in what seemed like a relatively contemplative mood. Other times, he was just consumed by paranoia and his own sense of persecution and aggrievement. There were a couple of laments that appeared over and over again in his letters. He apparently didn't understand the conspiracy aspects of the law, and he repeatedly said, I'm in here serving time for your world's sins because you've made me into this epic pariah that has no relationship with who I really am, and I committed no crime. He said that over and over again. I committed no crime, by which I always assumed he meant I'm not the one who committed these murders. Therefore, I shouldn't have been found guilty of them. And he denied, of course, that it was his direction that caused these people to go out and commit these horrible murders. So that was one of his repeated themes. Another one, and it was illustrated in a fascinating way. Can I tell a little story here?
Sure.
About this interesting juncture in my correspondence with him. I said he had a 4th or 5th grade education, and he repeatedly said, I can't write. I feel like these words are running out the end of my pencil, and I can't control them. I can't express myself to you in writing. He was very frustrated with his inability to communicate. And he kept saying that he was convinced I was a woman writing under a man's name because my handwriting was too neat. He didn't associate neat handwriting with men. And so he kept saying, I believe you're a woman writing under a man's name. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm a senior in college, and I'm beginning graduate school in the fall. But he kept lamenting his own limitations as a writer. And then he began with escalating intensity saying, send me pictures. Stop writing. These words are frustrating me. Send me pictures. And I thought, okay. I had sent Squeaky and her roommate, Sandy Good, another devoted Manson follower, I had sent them a picture of me because they had explicitly asked for one. And I made sure I chose a picture that looked nothing like me. Because I had intrusive thoughts of these women coming to the Midwest and seeking me out. So I didn't want them to identify me when I walked out of my apartment in Valparaiso, Indiana. But Manson never said, send me a picture of you. He just said, send me pictures.
He wasn't specific about what he wanted photographs of?
He wasn't, and I was too dim to figure it out looking back. He wanted a picture of me, and that's why I mentioned the fact that he kept saying, you're a woman, writing under a man's name. He wanted a picture to confirm my identity. Who are you? What do you look like? And I didn't get it. I didn't pick up on that. I just thought he wanted pictures. So I started thinking, well, what kind of picture might Charles Manson like? And I knew that one of his themes was society is evil and we need to go to the desert and so on. And so I was reading an article in the National Geographic one day about the search for the world's oldest people. And there was a picture in there of this, I think from South America somewhere, a shepherd sitting on a wooden stool playing a wooden flute with a dog laying on the floor next to him, a pastoral kind of scene. And I thought it was a totally benign choice on my part. I sent this picture to him. I didn't even put a Post-it note on it saying, hope you like this, Charlie, or anything like that. I just put the picture in an envelope and sent it. And then about 3 or 4 days later, I got the first and last airmail letter I've ever received from a maximum security prison. It may have been the only stamp that Manson had available to him at the time, but I saw that red airmail stamp and thought, oh, there's some kind of urgent message in this envelope. And in fact, there was. He just railed at me. He was absolutely furious. Said, I never realized what a fake and a phony you are, and called my mother all kinds of names and went on and on. By the third page, he was slashing across the page with his pencil. You could tell he was in a white-hot fury. And at the end of the letter, he said, I didn't like my picture. I don't like your letters. Don't write me. And I thought, okay. I thought that was the end of it. And then 2 days later, I got another letter from him coming as close to apologizing for something as I think Charles Manson ever comes. He said, I might have been wrong to get so angry at you and to assume that you were trying to aggravate me. I've had a hard life and it's your job. That's how he put it. It's your job to understand I've been a hard life And then in one of the late 20th century's great understatements, I'm sure, he said, I'm not really an easy person to get along with.
No kidding. We'd heard that, yeah. Charlie.
You won't get any argument from me.
Yeah.
But then in that letter, and the reason I tell this story, in that letter, he sent me a picture. And it looked like it could have come from National Geographic, too. Mm-hmm. It was a picture of a mule with its back piled high with, I don't know, they look like bags of mulch or something like that. And then Manson used a pencil to draw a line extending above the baggage on the mule's back. And then he drew lines to make it look like a globe. The theme being, I'm carrying the weight of your whole world on my shoulders, which one of the things he would say over and over again.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the logistics of this. And this is the second time we've had this kind of conversation, because we just interviewed Edna Cowell Martin, who is Ted Bundy's cousin. And
read her book, yes.
Yes, she just came out with this book, Dark Tide, and we had her on the show recently. And never having written, I'd have to double check with Kristin, but I've never written to a person in prison before, certainly not on death row. The logistics of the letters back and forth, were your letters handwritten and his letters handwritten? You mentioned a pencil in his example.
In both cases, mostly yes. I remember my first letter to him, I typed on my little Selectric typewriter, but most of my letters, I think, were handwritten. His were always handwritten. And I'm thinking of John Wayne Gacy, whose letters were almost always typed, but Manson's were almost always handwritten. The letters I got from Squeaky Fromme and Sandy Good, her roommate, in the months prior to the assassination attempt were all handwritten. Of course, they weren't in prison, which is
that's a whole different story. So how cognizant were either of you of the fact that, as we understand it, letters in and out of prison are read by prison authorities? Our understanding is that, for instance, someone like Manson, in sending Jeff Smalldon in Valparaiso, Indiana, a letter, he would be showing it to someone who would review it before it went out. Were you at all aware of any of those things happening?
It's an interesting question. I was so young and naive and ignorant. I don't think I was even thinking of those things. Manson, who'd spent most of his life in prison, presumably was. However, and I'm sure you've had this sense from the work that you guys do, it's amazing how many criminals, people in jails and prisons, they know that their phone calls are being monitored, but they say incredibly incriminating things. And I always think, what are they doing? Are they not thinking at all about the authorities listening in on these calls? But as for Manson, he never said anything incriminating. Quite the opposite. He said, I never did anything wrong. But whether he was thinking in terms of the authorities screening his letters, I don't know.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors.
Minimally invasive neurosurgery. Doctors who specialize in brain and spine surgery.
Valley Health System in northern New Jersey is home to a premier neurosurgical team.
The least invasive treatments that avoid the need for an incision.
They are experts in the most advanced techniques.
Technologies that promote shorter recovery times.
And the things that matter most of all.
Keeping you close to your family.
Neurosurgery at Valley Health System. It's everything medicine can do, a few things medicine can't.
Creating great retail experiences is tough, especially with multiple stores, teams of staff, fulfillment centers, separate workflows. It's a lot. But with Shopify Point of Sale, you can do it all without complexity. Shopify's point of sale system is a unified command center for your retail business. It brings together in-store and online operations, even across 1,000 locations. Imagine being able to guarantee that shopping is just always convenient. Endless aisle, ship to customer, buy online, pick up in store, all made simpler so customers can shop how and where they want. And staff have the tools they need to close the sale every time. And let's face it, acquiring new customers is expensive. With Shopify POS, you can keep existing shoppers coming back to your stores with consistent, tailored experiences and first-party data that gives marketing teams a competitive edge. Want more? Check out shopify.com/try, all lowercase, and learn how to create the best retail experiences without complexity. Shopify.com/try.
As a small business owner, you put in unlimited hours, unlimited effort, and unlimited passion. Why? Because you know that your business has unlimited potential. Spectrum Business can connect you to that potential with the fastest, most reliable internet, US-based customer support, and multi-layer security to protect your business. To learn how Spectrum Business can put anything within reach, visit spectrum.com/business. Your business made limitless. That's life unlimited.
We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
In talking to Manson and then later to John Wayne Gacy, notably, and many other people who were on death row or just in prison, what facets of human behavior or human nature, human motivation were you attempting to understand by interviewing? And I guess maybe befriending isn't the word that I want. You're not befriending these killers, but I'm also not sure what verb to use there. So I would love to know what verb you would use in its place. I don't feel like I should say you're befriending Manson, but tell me what verb you would choose, and then what were you trying to get out of these conversations with them?
I certainly never thought of it in terms of befriending them. I would say creating a situation that made it possible for me to engage with them at a horizontal level. Something I always tried to bring was a non-judgmental attitude, which didn't mean that I didn't have any feelings toward what they had done. The opposite is true. But I always wanted to communicate a willingness to hear their point of view, and interest in their point of view, and a genuine curiosity about them as human beings. And this is true both with the contacts with Manson, Gacy, and others before I became a forensic psychologist. And it's also true about my way of relating to the many, way beyond 1,000 killers that I dealt with during my career as a forensic psychologist. For example, and I think some other people in my field would maybe criticize me for this, I always introduce myself as Jeff. I never wanted to create a situation that seemed like I was talking down to them from a position of authority. I would introduce myself as Jeff, hand them my business card so they could figure out quickly enough that I had my PhD and so on. They didn't need me to tell them that, but I wanted to create a situation where we could communicate on a horizontal level. And I tried to accomplish that when I was corresponding as well.
Would they have access to the internet or other resources that would allow them to look into who you were?
Not back then. One of the things in my book, and I tried hard to include regular reminders of this because I think it's easy to lose sight of, but I was describing events that occurred 50 years ago, particularly with respect to the Manson people. These things were happening in the mid-'70s, so the internet was still a long ways off. Same was true with Gacy in the 80s. No, that was never an issue. Now it would be more a question. I would wonder what kinds of access they had to computers and so on.
You tell a fascinating story about visiting with John Wayne Gacy on death row. We want people to read the book, obviously, but it's a fascinating book and an incredible story. Tell us a little bit about, if visiting's the right word, with Gacy. I was shocked by how little effort there was made to protect you as an individual.
So was I. And it's why I include the one scene with Gacy as the prologue to my book because it was shocking to me, frankly. But there I was, my second year of graduate school. I had never been in the same room before with someone who had been found guilty of one murder, let alone 33 murders. So I was still very naive, even though I had begun graduate work that would eventually lead to my career. And I just remember I made 2 different trips to see Gacy on death row in Illinois, and I recount one thing that happened during the first one. As I say in my book, when we got to what the people at the prison referred to as the condemned unit, that was the phrase they used for death row, I was about to go into the death row visiting area. There was a big iron, big steel, whatever, gate that I had to go through, my last portal to pass through before I'd reach the room where I was going to meet with Gacy for the first time. And just as I was about to walk through the door, the guard who had accompanied me there said something to the effect of, "I know you understand why Mr. Gacy is on our condemned unit, and I know you've come a long way to visit him. I just want you to know that should anything go awry while you're with him, or God forbid, should a hostage situation develop, you'll be on your own, because prison policy is that we don't negotiate with inmates. You understand?"
Oh my God.
And I remember saying, yeah, well, what else was I going to say? I wasn't going to bail out at that point. I'd driven 450 miles for this visit. And so I said, yeah, but as I describe in more colorful detail in my book, I lost my concentration for a minute and forgot to ask if there was a restroom back there, and ended up having to request Mr. Gacy's help to find a restroom, which is something that no normal person would ever want to have to do.
Yeesh. There's something so unbelievably creepy about it.
I was just going to say there were no guards back in that area at all. I ended up having to scream to get a guard's attention to take me to a restroom. And it was a situation that Gacy loved because it converged exactly with his fantasy of a young man unable to get help and totally under Gacy's control. And he loved it. He thought it was fantastic that I was unable to get anybody to assist me in finding a restroom.
I'm sorry. I'm looking at the picture in the back of the book of the two of you together. How could you stand being that close to him?
Well,
how could you stand it?
There's a little story there. The reason I'm smiling and Gacy's looking mildly perturbed is that right before that picture was taken by a guard who I think I had paid $5 to have 2 pictures taken, and the guard appeared with the camera. And so Gacy and I got up from the table and stood next to one another. And as the guard was looking through his camera, he said, "JW, why are you taking up so much of the frame?" And Gacy was sensitive about his weight at that point. So he wasn't happy. I thought it was funny. I don't know, Kristin. You asked, how did I get that close to him? I did a number of times. He asked me to come over to his side of the table multiple times during my visits with him so that we could look over his photo album and so on. He wanted to show me things. And I remember at the time thinking, I don't really want to do that. But I also didn't want to communicate to him that I felt afraid of him. So I did do it and positioned myself in a way so that I felt I could move quickly if I had to. But he could very easily, even though he had handcuffs on and leg manacles, it would not have been difficult for him to put those handcuffs over my head and squeeze my neck with his forearms, had he been so inclined. And I was frankly too naive at the time to fully understand the jeopardy I was in. At that point, Gacy still was holding on to the fantasy that his appeals might result in some relief for him, at least where the death penalty was concerned. The reason I included the detail I did from Jason Moss's book, Moss's contacts with Gacy occurred. This is a young man who wrote an honors paper based on his attempts to open up lines of communication with serial killers by posturing as their quote unquote ideal victim. And he did this with Gacy, and he ended up visiting Gacy and then writing about it in a book that was published after Gacy's execution. But it was obvious to me in reading Moss's book that he had met Gacy in exactly the same place where I did. To put it mildly, he had a different and very harrowing experience with Gacy, and it freaked me out, frankly. When that book came out, I thought, at the point when he saw Gacy, Gacy knew the gig was up, that his appeals were not going to result in any relief, and he was going to be executed in a few months. So he basically had nothing to lose, whereas he would have had a lot to lose from attacking me back in 86 or 87.
And in the photograph, it's pretty evident that Gacy is substantially larger than you are, and that I actually think he might have been able to overpower you. And here's a guy who has killed at least 30, mostly young men. He has a significant amount of physical strength. That vision you described a moment ago of him slipping his handcuffs, those manacles, around your neck from behind, that's not much of a stretch to think that he might have had that capability.
He absolutely would have had that capability. And I think he could have easily overcome me had he decided to do that. And I should have been thinking more about it than I was, frankly. I was wary, but not. I had that thought of what he could do, but I put it to the back of my mind. I just tried hard to compartmentalize it because I thought, if you're thinking all the time while you're sitting next to him that he could be on the verge of strangling you, it's going to be very difficult to interact with him in the kind of familiar, relaxed way you want to. But yeah, scary situation for sure.
And I like that you bookended that story with the very last one that you tell in the book about meeting with Alva Campbell and how the guard called you over and said he could strangle you with your necktie. So maybe you want to take that necktie off, and you walk yourself through the process of taking off the tie. And this guy is watching you, and he clearly knows it's exactly what the guard has said to you. And you pull the tie off, and he says, "You feel better now, Doc?" It was like, oh my God.
With the smile on his face. Yeah, have you made yourself feel safe now, Doc? He understood what the guard had told me.
Oof.
Yeah, that's another... One thing I hoped in this book, that I was a relatable narrator.
Oh, totally.
I didn't try to gloss over the times where I wasn't thinking about things I should have been thinking of, or I made mistakes. I should have known by the time I had my interactions with Alva Campbell in the mid-1990s that it wasn't a good idea to have a tie on when you met someone like him. But I had just been in court all afternoon on a domestic case, had gone directly to the jail, and just wasn't really thinking about it. And I should have been, but I wasn't, until the guard called my attention to it and said, if he thought he could get out of here by strangling you with your necktie, he would do that in a hot second and not think about it at all.
That has to make your blood run cold to hear that.
It was just, a reminder. And Alva Campbell was a very violent man who had engaged in all kinds of violent acts before. He was very capable of being violent, and he was very manipulative. So, he could have decided it made sense to take that risk.
My thought was, there's probably no dress code in jail either, so you didn't really need to be quite so dressed up like you would have been for court earlier that day.
No, typically when I would go to the jail, I'd have jeans on, not a T-shirt, button-down shirt or some sneakers, very casual. But I had come directly from court that day. It made it an anomalous day for me because I was already dressed up in my court uniform.
Jeff, did you ever reach a point in all of this correspondence and research where you felt like, okay, I've bitten off more than I can chew here. Like, I'm emotionally not capable of compartmentalizing and handling all of this. This is dark and intense subject matter. I guess for lack of a better term, how do you keep yourself healthy when this is the headspace that you are in all the time?
Yeah, I don't know that I always succeeded in keeping myself healthy. I eventually bailed out of the correspondence with Manson, eventually bailed out of the one with Gacy years later after 3 years, because I became just exhausted by the demands of trying to engage them. It was a very psychologically and emotionally taxing project to maintain an ongoing epistolary relationship with these people. I didn't want to make them really angry, both because in Manson's case, I knew that he had sympathizers / followers outside prison. And I'll tell a little story in a second. But I didn't know how far his reach extended and what he might do if I made him really angry. So that was always part of my thinking. And yeah, there were times where I became very, I don't know what the right word would be, beyond wary, frightened, felt very vulnerable. I'll tell what happened with Manson's followers, and I think it's responsive to your question. This is in mid-1975. So this is a long time ago, almost 50 years. I began corresponding with Squeaky Fromme and her roommate, Sandy Good, who, as it turned out, lived in an attic apartment in Sacramento. They weren't in prison, but they were in regular contact with Manson, fervent devotees still. And in the months during the spring of 1975, there was an interesting and alarming progression in the rhetoric contained in their letters. In the very first letter that I got from Squeaky Fromme, and I include a picture of that envelope in my book, it wasn't what I expected. She was, by most accounts, Manson's second in command, his most favored girl, so to speak. And I had this idea in my mind, what would the first in command of somebody like Charles Manson sound like in a letter? What would it be like to hear her voice in a letter? And so when I got her first letter, it was in this envelope with floral accents, and the stationery had flowers on them. She drew little flowers and smiley faces and hearts, and all the talk was of peace and love and the companionship at Spahn Ranch. At one point, she paused to say, "Charlie didn't do it, Jeff. He is it." And she talked of him as the only person who knew how to bring about world peace and so on. And I remember thinking, what? What are you even talking about? It just sounded like so bizarre coming from Charles Manson's first in command. But then after that letter, her roommate Sandy Good took over the correspondence. And initially, her letters sounded the same way. And they both sounded very intelligent, articulate. And then suddenly things took a dark turn with Sandy Good. She had been dropping hints about things they wanted me to do. They were very upset with people they believed were polluting the environment and so on. And she kept saying things like, there are people you can contact to help us. Let us know when you're ready to do that. And I would just ignore those things and hope that they would go away. And then one time, this I believe was in May, I got a letter from Sandy that began with words that you never want a letter from a member of the Manson family to say. Jeff, we're moving out of the realm of words. And I remember thinking, I don't want to move out of the realm of words. That's the only realm I want to be.
Right. You're fine with words.
I'm fine with the realm of words. That's where I want to stay. But then she went on in that letter to say, to give me specific instructions about calling people. And up until that point, all the references to any crimes committed by members of the Manson family had been oblique and vague. But now she said, I want you to call these people and tell them Charles Manson demands that they stop polluting the environment. And if they ask who, say Charles Manson. Remember Sharon Tate?
Oh, my God.
Wow.
Yeah.
No one's reviewing these letters, speaking of prison authorities.
I became really alarmed at that point. And then she followed that up with a 16-page handwritten letter where she said, I want you to tell these people that soon a wave of assassins will sweep through their homes and splash blood from room to room.
Wow.
Started talking about people getting their arms chopped off and invited me to arrange a group of my friends who would be willing to go out in the woods and kill a hunter and then leave a sign on the trees saying, there are hunters hunting hunters. So she was basically trying to recruit me to actively become involved in this campaign of eco-terrorism. And at that point, I thought, okay, I'm in way over my head. I need an exit strategy. And I wasn't sure how to execute one that would work. And what I did was I wrote Squeaky and Sandy a letter. This was in June of 1975. And I told them that I had left the address where I'd been living in Western New York. It was actually my parents' address, but they didn't know that. My dad, by the way, was an FBI agent, and these letters from Charles Manson and Squeaky Fromme were coming to my father's address. But that's another whole element of the story. But I wrote this letter, and then I sent it to a good friend of mine who lived in Wisconsin, and I asked her to mail my letter from Wisconsin to get a Wisconsin postmark on it. In my letter, I'd said I'd left New York, I was hitchhiking around, didn't have a settled address.
Yeah, very vague about where I am.
Exactly. And the next thing I heard was Squeaky had attempted to assassinate President Ford. But getting back to your original question, Bill, about whether I ever felt, or maybe Kristin, you asked it, whether I felt like the emotional demands of continuing with this were too much. That was one such point.
Join us again next time on Mind Over Murder as we continue our conversation with Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon discussing his book, That Beast Was Not Me, One Forensic Psychologist, 5 Decades of Conversation with Killers.
That is going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.